In the rigid, iron-disciplined world of the Nazi Luftwaffe, Hans-Joachim Marseille was a walking disaster. Long before he was draped in diamonds and oak leaves as the Star of Africa, he was the boy the High Command wanted to bury. He was the antithesis of the Aryan soldier. He arrived at morning briefings with bloodshot eyes from a night of heavy drinking, his hair was long and unkempt, and he had a dangerous obsession with American jazz, music the Reich condemned as degenerate. He was nearly court-martialed not for cowardice, but for having so many high-profile girlfriends that it became a logistical problem for his commanders. His early career in the Battle of Britain was a mess. He was talented, but he was a lone wolf who abandoned his wingmen to chase individual glory. He was shot down 4 times, and his superiors were ready to wash their hands of the arrogant Berliner. But then, he was transferred to North Africa. The desert changed everything. In the vast, shimmering heat of the Sahara, the rules of European warfare vanished. There were no landmarks, no clouds to hide in, and the air was a turbulent, grit-filled haze. It was here that the rebel found his rhythm. Marseille stopped trying to be a soldier and started being a hunter. He stripped his Messerschmitt Bf 109 of everything unnecessary, painted a large yellow 14 on the side, and began to practice a form of aerial combat that shouldn't have been physically possible. While other pilots were taught to fly straight and level to get a steady shot, Marseille practiced high-speed, high-G turns. He developed a sixth sense for deflection shooting, the art of firing at a point in empty space where an enemy plane would be in 3 seconds. He became a god of the sky, not through brutality, but through a terrifying, balletic grace. To the Allied pilots of the Desert Air Force, he wasn't just another German. He was a phantom. They would look up to see a single yellow-nosed fighter diving through a formation of 20 planes, and before they could even radio a warning, 3 of their comrades would be falling in flames. He was 22 years old, a rock star in a flight suit, and he was about to set a record that would leave both sides in a state of absolute shock. Hans-Joachim Marseille did not see the sky the way other pilots did. To a standard fighter pilot, an aerial dogfight was a series of linear chases. You got behind the enemy, lined up your crosshairs, and fired. To Marseille, the sky was a 3-dimensional mathematical grid. He became the undisputed master of deflection shooting, an art form so difficult that most pilots avoided it entirely. He didn't want to be behind his enemy. He wanted to be at a 90-degree angle to them, slashing through their formation like a scythe. He turned his Bf 109 into a laboratory of physics. While his peers spent their downtime at the mess hall, Marseille would take his plane up alone into the desert heat. He would pick a speck on the ground or a lone cloud and practice snap shooting, dropping his flaps to bleed speed, pulling a violent high-G turn until his vision blurred, and firing a split-second burst at a point in empty space. He was training his brain to calculate the lead, the drop, and the speed of the target instinctively. He reached a point where he didn't even use his optical gun sight. He claimed it got in the way of his feel for the shot. His physical conditioning was equally legendary. To survive the G-forces of his signature turns, maneuvers that would cause other pilots to black out, Marseille developed incredible abdominal strength and leg power. He was a small, lithe man, but his body was built for the cockpit. This physical mastery allowed him to stay conscious while pulling turns so tight that his wings would literally groan under the stress. However, the most fascinating character in Marseille's life wasn't a German officer, but a Black South African prisoner of war named Matthias Letulu. After Matthias was captured, Marseille took him on as his personal assistant and friend. In the racial hierarchy of the Third Reich, this was an act of open defiance. Marseille didn't just have Matthias wash his clothes, he ate with him, protected him from the SS, and made it clear to his superiors that anyone who touched Matthias would have to answer to the Star of Africa. This relationship revealed the true Marseille, a man who lived in the Third Reich but refused to belong to it. He was a celebrity with a massive ego, yes, but he was also a man who valued individual loyalty over state ideology. He was a rock star who treated the war like a private stage, and his audience, both the High Command in Berlin and the terrified Allied pilots in the sky, were about to witness the greatest solo performance in the history of aerial warfare. September 1, 1942, remains the most statistically impossible day in the history of aerial combat. It was the peak of the battle for El Alamein, and the sky over the Egyptian desert was a swirling cauldron of dust and high-octane fuel. On this day, Hans-Joachim Marseille didn't just fly, he conducted a massacre. By the time the sun set, he had claimed 17 Allied aircraft in 3 separate sorties. To put that in perspective, many ace pilots take an entire war to reach 5 kills. Marseille did it in a single afternoon. The second mission of the day is where the legend turned into something approaching the supernatural. At 10:47 a.m., Marseille spotted a formation of British P-40 Kittyhawks. What followed was a 10-minute whirlwind of violence that defied every tactical manual ever written. Between 10:55 and 11:05, Marseille shot down 8 planes. He wasn't dogfighting, he was executing. He would dive from the sun, pull a vertical yo-yo maneuver, and fire a single 3-second burst of 20mm cannon fire into the cockpit of an enemy plane before the pilot even knew he was under attack. His wingman, Rainer Potkin, struggled just to keep him in sight. Potkin later recounted that he could barely keep up with the radio calls. Marseille would shout, "Horrido!" the Luftwaffe victory cry, and before Potkin could mark the coordinates, another plane would be exploding. Marseille's accuracy was so high that he averaged only 15 bullets per kill. Most pilots would spray hundreds of rounds just to get a probable hit. Marseille was hitting moving targets while pulling 6GS, aiming for the engine blocks and the pilot's seats with the precision of a surgeon. When he landed back at the dirt strip in Gazala, the ground crew was in a state of religious awe. Marseille climbed out of the yellow 14, his flight suit soaked through with sweat, his hands shaking from the adrenaline dump. He looked less like a victorious hero and more like a man who had seen a ghost. He had single-handedly gutted a British squadron in the time it takes to boil an egg. The news reached Berlin within hours. The Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive, painting him as the invincible Star of Africa. But back in the desert, Marseille sat in his tent with Matthias. Exhausted and silent. He knew that he had reached the apex of his skill, a level of performance so high that the human body and the machine could no longer sustain it. He was 22 years old, he had 158 kills, and he was beginning to realize that in the desert, the only prize for being the best hunter is that you never get to stop hunting. Hans-Joachim Marseille was the Luftwaffe's greatest asset, but to the Nazi Party, he was a political nightmare. As his fame reached stratospheric levels, the Reich attempted to mold him into the perfect Aryan poster boy. They failed miserably. Marseille didn't just ignore the party line, he openly mocked it. While Joseph Goebbels was painting him as a Teutonic knight, Marseille was back in the desert, wearing frayed shorts, listening to the forbidden jazz of Louis Armstrong, and living a lifestyle that would have seen any other soldier sent to a penal battalion. The true crisis point came when the Star of Africa was summoned to Germany to receive the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the highest military honor at the time. During a high-profile reception attended by the Nazi elite, including Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, Marseille was asked to play the piano. The room went silent, expecting a rousing German march or perhaps a piece by Wagner. Instead, Marseille, with a smirk on his face, began to play ragtime and American jazz. It was a calculated, public insult to the regime's cultural purity laws. The High Command sat in stunned, icy silence as the Führer's favorite pilot played the degenerate music of the enemy in the heart of the Reich. But his most dangerous act of rebellion was his friendship with Matthias Letulu. As the war ground on, the SS began to take a closer interest in the racial composition of the frontline units. When SS officers visited Marseille's desert base and saw a black South African man serving as the personal assistant to the Reich's greatest hero, they were livid. They demanded Matthias be sent to a concentration camp. Marseille's response was immediate and lethal. He made it clear that Matthias was under his personal protection. He reportedly told his superiors that if anything happened to Matthias, the Star of Africa would stop flying. This created a massive dilemma for the Nazi leadership. They couldn't arrest Marseille. He was a national idol, a god whose face was on every newspaper. Yet, they couldn't control him. Marseille lived in a bubble of his own making, protected by his 158 kills. However, the psychological weight of the war was beginning to crack the rock star facade. He was flying up to 6 missions a day, pushing his body to the absolute limit to protect his men and his friend. He was a man trapped between 2 worlds. He hated the regime he served, yet he was the only thing standing between his squadron and total annihilation in the desert heat. He was a rebel without a cause, fighting a war he didn't believe in, protected only by the fact that he was too good at killing to be silenced. On September 30th, 1942, the desert sky was clear, but the air felt heavy. Hans-Joachim Marseille, just 22 years old and at the peak of his fame, climbed into a brand new Messerschmitt Bf 109G2. He didn't want to fly it, he preferred his older, yellow 14, a machine he knew like his own heartbeat. But the new Gustav model was faster, more powerful, and supposed to keep him alive against the growing number of Allied fighters. It was supposed to be a standard patrol, but for the first time, the hunter was being stalked by a mechanical ghost. Halfway through the flight, the cockpit suddenly began to fill with acrid, oily smoke. A glycol pipe had ruptured, and the engine, the heart of his machine, was eating itself. The Star of Africa was being blinded. Marseille struggled to breathe as the temperature in the cockpit spiked to a furnace-like heat. He opened the canopy, desperately trying to vent the fumes, but the smoke was too thick. He radioed his wingman, Rainer Potkin, his voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos. "I have to get out now. I can't see any more." Marseille rolled the aircraft onto its back, the standard procedure for a bailout, and released his harness. But as he fell away from the plane, something went horribly wrong. Because of the smoke and the disorientation, he didn't clear the tail. The vertical stabilizer of the fast-moving Messerschmitt struck him in the chest, knocking him unconscious or killing him instantly. His parachute never opened. The greatest pilot in the desert fell like a stone, striking the sand near the white mosque of Sidi Abdul Rahman. He wasn't shot down. The Allies couldn't kill him, so his own machine did. When the recovery team found him, his body was remarkably intact, except for the massive trauma where the tail had hit him. He was lying face down in the sand he had mastered. The reaction across North Africa was a stunned, haunting silence. His squadron was paralyzed with grief. They had lost not just a commander, but their rock star. Even more incredible was the reaction of the Desert Air Force. When news of Marseille's death reached the British and South African squadrons, the men who had spent months trying to kill him held a somber toast. They recognized that a unique light had gone out of the sky. Matthias Letulu, the man Marseille had protected from the SS, was devastated. He stayed with the squadron until the end, eventually being repatriated after the war, carrying the memory of the German rebel who had treated him as an equal when the rest of the world was descending into madness. Marseille was buried in a small casket in the desert, his grave marked simply with his name and a cross. The Star of Africa had burned out at the age of 22, leaving behind a legacy that was as much about his defiance of the Reich as it was about his 158 victories. The legacy of Hans-Joachim Marseille is a haunting anomaly in the history of warfare. He was the rock star of the Luftwaffe, a man whose face was plastered on propaganda posters while his heart remained firmly in the degenerate jazz clubs of his youth. Even decades later, his 158 victories remain a benchmark of pure technical skill. Modern fighter pilots, training in supersonic jets with computer-assisted targeting, still study the Marseille method. They analyze his ability to lead a target, to fire at the empty sky where the enemy would be in 3 seconds, as the ultimate expression of human-machine synergy. He proved that even in the age of industrial slaughter, a single individual with enough feel for the air could disrupt an entire theater of war. However, Marseille's legacy is more than just a tally of broken wings and burning engines. He complicates the historical narrative of the clean Luftwaffe. While he fought for a regime that practiced systemic genocide, his personal conduct, his public mockery of Hitler, his refusal to join the Nazi Party, and his fierce protection of Matthias Letulu, presents the image of a man who was internally at war with his own uniform. He became a symbol of the Knight of the Air, a tragic figure caught in a web of duty to his comrades and loathing for his leaders. To the men who flew against him, Marseille was the Star of Africa, because he brought a sense of individual brilliance to a war that was becoming increasingly mechanized and anonymous. After the war, his grave in Egypt became a site of pilgrimage for pilots from both sides. They didn't go there to celebrate the Third Reich. They went to honor a 22-year-old boy who had mastered the sky in a way no human ever had before or likely ever will again. Matthias Letulu eventually returned to South Africa, forever carrying the story of the German pilot who risked his life and career to save him. Their friendship remains the most enduring part of the Marseille legend, a flicker of human decency in the middle of a desert war defined by its brutality. Hans-Joachim Marseille died young, leaving behind a yellow 14 that remains one of the most famous aircraft in history. He was a rebel, a virtuoso, and a protector, a man whose life was as fast and violent as the deflection shots that made him a god.